Welcome to Medmarc's Risk Management webinar series. I am Heather Thompson, Assistant Vice President of Marketing for Medmarc. I'm so pleased to kick off today's annual presentation, Ripped from the Headlines, Hot Topics in Life Sciences for 2025, with our very own risk management team members, Klaus and Zuhal Reed. Kate and Zuhal are both members of our Medmarc Risk Management Services team. Kate is our senior risk management attorney specializing in food and drug regulatory with experience in the regulated industry, private practice, and at the FDA. Zuhal is our risk management attorney specializing in biotechnology, who has most recently earned her Master of Science in Applied Biotechnology from the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. They both work closely with clients to help identify exposures, review contracts, provide guidance on regulatory standards, and build risk mitigation strategies. This is a great service that we offer with our policy, and our policyholders have access to our risk management team for all kinds of guidance on best practices. With that, I am pleased to turn it over to Kate, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks so much, Heather. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kate Klaus, and with me today is my colleague, Zuhal Reed. We're looking forward to talking about some of the hot topics in life sciences news from the past year, many of which are still in flux and will be on the agenda for further changes next year as well. So let's get into it with one of the biggest sources of life sciences headlines this year and discuss the changes in healthcare leadership and policy direction implemented by the Trump administration. One of the early appointments of the Trump administration was that of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. He was nominated and confirmed by the Senate within 3.5 weeks of the inauguration and was sworn into office on the same day he was confirmed. Shortly thereafter, Martin Makary was nominated as the FDA commissioner. He was confirmed by the Senate at the end of March and sworn in on April 1st. Both Kennedy and Makary were controversial choices for their roles. They are known as disruptors. Kennedy has long been known for his opinions on vaccines and alternative health theories that differ from evidence-based medicine. In addition, since assuming his role, Kennedy has exerted unprecedented influence over FDA policy, which really breaks with the tradition of HHS secretaries who have allowed FDA leaders a degree of autonomy. They're supposed to be an independent department within Health and Human Services. Unlike Kennedy, Makary is a surgeon by training, and he does have significant experience in health policy. He has pledged to restore trust in science through transparency at FDA, and he is also fully aligned with the administration's deregulatory agenda. And that deregulatory agenda has been significant. There has been an aggressive push toward deregulation across the administrative agencies, and FDA has not been accepted from this agenda. The administration has instituted a requirement that for every new regulation that is implemented, 10 have to be eliminated. For an agency like FDA, where the regulations are responsible for the conduct of incredibly complex industries, this is a substantial barrier to implementation of new regulations. FDA has instituted a review of its regulations to scrap any rules that have been deemed outdated, but this raises concerns about the potential for gaps in guidance for industry, particularly in emerging technologies. Both Kennedy and Makary have pledged to focus on radical transparency at the healthcare agencies, and this includes the introduction of a number of public data dashboards. Though the implementation of these changes has been delayed a degree by staffing upheavals at FDA, which we will also discuss. One of the radical transparency measures discussed for FDA is real-time safety reporting. That said, real-time safety reporting has been in place for quite some time. Both the drug and device adverse event reporting databases have been updated at least weekly and continue to be. Recall data similarly is updated even more frequently. It remains to be seen what additional transparency is on the horizon. One potential concern here is that if the focus is on real time and getting data directly to the people as soon as it comes in, this may mean that the data could be dirty. It could have things like duplicates or user complaints that aren't necessarily related to product technology. And these things can muddy the waters and provide a false picture of the safety or uh, potential harms of products. Deregulation also has the potential to impact a number of technologies like biosimilars and gene therapy. Under new draft guidance from October of 2025, biosimilar sponsors generally no longer need to conduct costly human trials to compare their product to the reference biologic. Instead, FDA is emphasizing comparative analytical assessments and pharmacokinetic studies as sufficient evidence of biosimilarity. This is much like the ability of generic drug manufacturers to present evidence that their product it works the same way, is as safe and as effective as the brand drug. They're doing lab studies, analytical assessments, and pharmacokinetics to demonstrate that the products function in the body the same way. Uh, if implemented for biosimilars, this shift could cut development timelines drastically, something from 6 to 9 years to more like 2 to 4 years, and it could save hundreds of millions of dollars per program. The picture for gene therapy is a bit more complex, and it has had less of a positive response. There was an initial push for flexibility in gene therapy. Early in the Trump administration's second term, FDA leadership signaled support for conditional approvals and single arm trials for very rare diseases. Because they were concerned about the feasibility of randomized trials in conditions that are incredibly rare. If you can't get enough subjects to enroll to complete your trial, then you can't ever get the data that you need to support your application. So this was seen as pro-innovation because it could benefit those small patient populations with rare diseases in getting products that could help them to market. However, despite this earlier flexibility, there have been some recent FDA actions that show that they're maybe requiring stricter evidence standards going forward. There was a recent setback for a Huntington's disease gene therapy product. And FDA withdrew its prior agreement to accept data from a clinical trial for accelerated approval. They demanded that the manufacturer, the sponsor, really needed to provide them with more robust evidence of the safety and effectiveness in order for them to continue evaluating the product for approval. There have also been safety concerns that have triggered clinical holds on trials. There was a CRISPR-based therapy that had life-threatening liver toxicity events, and that trial was placed on hold. Similar issues have arisen across multiple sponsors, where FDA is putting a halt on trials and products that are showing some degree of risk to the patient. So why this shift from the initial push for getting these products to market in a flexible manner faster to this more conservative approach? The answer is really that they have been responsive to these high profile adverse events and patient deaths. It has heightened the scrutiny. There has been media attention to it. So they're going back to that more conservative approach, despite the initial political pressures for speed. They're now really focusing on that long-term safety monitoring and gathering all of the evidence that they need to demonstrate effectiveness, even in the case of rare diseases. One of the biggest stories of the year has been the unprecedented reduction in force at FDA this year. They were forced to cut roughly 20% of their staff, which included many senior leaders. Some entire policy teams were dismantled, and more than half of senior leadership exited within 6 months. Some of the key departures included highly respected figures like Peter Marks, who had been the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research for years, and Patrizia Cavazzoni, who is at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And this left really critical gaps in institutional knowledge. The changes have introduced some disruption to review timelines. There have been issues in getting guidance documents issued because the guidance review process was interrupted. There have been difficulties with sponsor engagement, which has created uncertainty for regulated industry. If they can't get their questions answered by FDA, it slows their ability to get their work done, to submit their work to the agency. In addition to the massive loss of institutional knowledge that comes with a reduction in force that is so substantial, a fifth of the agency's staff, uh, there's a real concern that this brain drain is going to be very difficult to overcome. Many federal employees chose their jobs due to a call to serve, as well as the knowledge that federal jobs were very secure. It allowed them to hone their policy expertise for long periods of time, and it was worth it to them to sacrifice the lower salaries that they received at federal agencies versus those that they may have found in the private sector. But if we're eliminating the security of federal jobs and we're limiting their ability to stay long term and really hone that expertise, it may be very difficult to recruit new employees, which could hamper agency operations for decades to come. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zahal for our next topic.
Thank you, Kate. So, I want to talk about a topic that has generated a lot of headlines and questions in the life sciences world, the FDA's evolving guidance on artificial intelligence enabled devices. Now, if you follow this space, you know the challenge. AI devices don't stay still. They learn, they adapt, and they get better over time. Now, that's great for innovation, but it breaks the traditional frozen in time model of FDA review. So, when the FDA released its final guidance on predetermined change control plans, or PCCPs, at the end of 2024, followed by the lifecycle management draft guidance in early 2025, it marked a real turning point for how these technologies will be reviewed, approved, and monitored moving forward. So, what exactly is a PCCP, and why should legal, regulatory, and risk professionals care about it? A PCCP is a pre approved plan that a manufacturer submits with their marketing application for an AI enabled device. It essentially says to the FDA, here's how we plan to improve or modify this device over time, and here's the framework we're going to use to do it safely. The plan generally includes three major parts. Number one, you have your anticipated modifications, meaning what changes you expect to make to the algorithm or model. Second, you have your modification protocol. So that's how you'll test, validate, and control those changes. And finally, the impact assessment. That is how you'll ensure any update doesn't undermine safety or effectiveness. Now, this gives companies some flexibility to make algorithm updates without having to resubmit for every small change, as long as the change falls within the parameters of the PCCP that FDA already reviewed and cleared. From a legal standpoint, so the key takeaway really is that this isn't just a regulatory exercise. These are really documents that can potentially become exhibits one day. So if there's ever an investigation, an enforcement action, or a product's liability claim, your PCCP, your validation data, and your change control records are what really demonstrate that you stayed within your approved boundaries. Now, even once a device is cleared, the responsibility doesn't end there. AI introduces what I like to call dynamic performance risk. So your algorithm might work perfectly in January, but perform differently by July once real world data starts coming in. The FDA's life cycle guidance emphasizes that as devices evolve, labels and warnings need to evolve too. So that means you need to make sure your instructions for use and user training materials reflect not just how the device worked at launch, but how it may change over time. So, for example, if your PCCP anticipates a future software update that expands use to a new patient population, you'll need to consider whether the labeling or the risk disclosures are still adequate once that update goes live. Now, for counsel, for example, this raises the classic duty to warn questions. How and when do you communicate those changes to users, clinicians, or distributors to preserve your defense? From here, let me shift to some practical guidance, like what companies should actually be doing. So, for manufacturers, build your PCCP right into your quality management system, not as an afterthought. Your design history file, validation reports, and change control procedures should map directly to what you committed to in your PCCP. Develop a clear post market monitoring plan that includes how you'll track model performance in the field and feed those results back into your validation process. And if you rely on outside vendors, for example, a partner maybe who provides training data or even algorithm components, make sure that your contracts give you access to the documentation you need to support your PCCP commitments. For users and purchasers, so these are hospitals, clinics, your pharma partners, you need to verify that the version you're using actually matches the version cleared under the PCCP, and make sure your agreements require the manufacturer to notify you of any performance updates or label changes. So, from a liability perspective, I think we're going to start seeing some familiar legal theories that might be applied in new ways. So, plaintiffs may allege that a manufacturer failed to update warnings after an algorithm changed or failed to monitor performance as promised in its PCCP. So, for underwriters and brokers in the audience who might be listening, these guidances create new questions for due diligence. You want to ask things like: does the company maintain verifiable version control? Can they show that they follow their PCCP protocol for each fielded update? And if something goes wrong, do they have a defined process for field corrections or recalls? So, to summarize basically what's happened recently and some of the documents that I'm sure you'll all want to be aware of, in December 2024, the FDA finalized the PCC guidance, turning what had been a draft framework into an actual enforceable standard. In January 2025, the FDA issued the draft guidance on AI device lifecycle management, expanding expectations around data governance, validation, and monitoring. And in mid 2025, FDA, Health Canada, and the UK's MHRA released joint guiding principles, signaling a sort of international alignment on these frameworks. So, what can we potentially expect heading into 2026, given all of that? So, we'll likely see many more submissions that include PCCPs, especially for adaptive algorithms that continuously learn. We can also expect, I think, much closer scrutiny of post market monitoring programs and how companies collect and respond to real world data performance. And perhaps most importantly, labeling and transparency, I think, will become a focal point, both for regulators and especially for litigators, as devices continue to evolve after approval. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. So next up, let's talk about vaccines. Vaccines have long been a cornerstone of public health, but 2025 marked a pretty dramatic shift in US vaccine regulation and policy. Driven by new leadership at HHS and FDA, these changes reflect a broader political and scientific debate over the safety, liability, and public trust around vaccines. So let's talk a bit about the implications of these changes. In addition to Kennedy and McCary, there are two other key forces at FDA who weigh in quite heavily on vaccines. One is Vinay Prasad, who is FDA's Chief Medical and Scientific Officer, as well as the Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which is a center responsible for vaccine oversight. And Tracy Beth Hogue, who is a Senior Clinical Science Advisor and a Special Assistant to the FDA Commissioner. These two individuals both advocated for narrowing vaccine recommendations and revisiting safety assumptions. And they are heavy influences in the oversight of vaccines at FDA. One of the first initiatives was a COVID-19 vaccine policy overhaul. They wanted to implement what was described as a risk-based framework. So FDA now limits COVID-19 boosters to adults 65 and older, as well as those with comorbidities, so some other disease that makes them more vulnerable to COVID, like heart disease or diabetes. Healthy younger adults and children were largely excluded unless there was new clinical trial data to support the benefit of these vaccines for them. In addition, there were federal recommendations introduced for COVID vaccination during pregnancy. This recommendation was withdrawn, which sparked quite a lot of debate in the obstetric community as well as in public health groups. There was substantial concern for patients who did not receive COVID vaccination during pregnancy, both because of the somewhat decreased immune system performance during pregnancy, as well as the fact that vaccine effectiveness has been shown to carry over to some degree in protecting infants after they're born, as well as being the fact that they would be surrounded by adults who are similarly protected by the vaccine. There was a real concern about the public health implications from the withdrawal of this recommendation. The emergency use authorizations for COVID vaccines were officially revoked, requiring all vaccines to get full approval, which signaled the end of that pandemic era flexibility. But this was a long time coming. It was part of the wind down of pandemic operations. So this was something that the companies were already prepared for. They had already sought authorization for use of the vaccine beyond for pandemic purposes. The vaccines had been thoroughly studied, the data had been submitted, they had been deemed safe and effective. So that is not a particularly substantial change. One of the more concerning changes was the ending of multiple programs that were looking at R&D for new flu vaccines. The government had been studying for a number of years using mRNA technology to prepare for what could be a pandemic in the future, looking at bird flu. A number of these contracts were in late stage vaccine development, and the agency decided they were going to cancel all of these contracts. This was both short-sighted in the development of products that could be used in the future, as well as sort of a loss of the cost that had already been sunk into the development of these products. Most of their partners have stated that they intend to continue with the development, but they're lacking that federal funding as well as the relationship with the agency that is going to have to approve these vaccines in the future, which could make it more of a challenge for them to actually get them to market and to conduct the clinical trials that will be necessary to get the products to market. There were also a number of contracts canceled for the purchase of vaccine doses, which could have some impact on the vaccine supply in the United States, the government's stockpile of vaccine doses. One of the most significant changes, and one that is of quite a bit of concern, has to do with ACIP, which is the advisory committee of the CDC. It's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. There were previously 17 members of this advisory committee, and earlier this year, all 17 members of the advisory committee were terminated. They were replaced. Many of these people were independent vaccine advisors. They were experienced epidemiologists, public health experts. They weren't necessarily known for having an agenda to push. They were based in science. It was evidence-based medicine and evidence-based public health support. These independent advisors were replaced with a team that Kennedy identified on his own. This was really an unprecedented move for an HHS secretary. Some of the new members of the advisory committee are vocal anti-vaccine activists. But in addition to the concern regarding this entirely new team of advisory committee members, was just last month, this committee faced some additional challenges in that the entire staff at the CDC that operates to support this advisory committee and any outside experts was terminated. And these staff they are not government appointees. They are long-term staff. They're intended to be there to support institutional knowledge, to guide logistics, to provide subject matter expertise, and to make sure that the committee is following all of the rules and regulations that are in place. And that entire department is now gone. So there is a lot of concern about what is going to happen with this advisory committee in the future. The committee was supposed to meet in October. The meeting was indefinitely postponed. This is the team that determines which strains of flu are going to be in the flu shot every year, and which strains of COVID are going to be in the COVID shot. A lot of what this team does really impacts the day-to-day health of the population of the United States. So this confusion is a challenge for both medical providers as well as the industry that really relies on the word and the recommendations in order to ensure that the vaccines are getting to the public as needed. Part of the challenge here is that states tend to rely on the recommendations of the advisory committee in order to create their own vaccine access rules. And there was a big impact this year in states which included Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, New Jersey. They all had to introduce their own vaccine rules in order to allow the people who live in their states to access the COVID vaccine. I'll give you an example. So in the state of Massachusetts, in order to get your vaccine at any pharmacy, to just walk into Walgreens and get your COVID shot, there has to be, it's written into the state rules for practice of pharmacy that pharmacies are permitted to give out vaccines that are recommended by ACIP, by the CDC Advisory Committee. Because that recommendation was not in place that year, you could not just walk into Walgreens here and get your COVID shot. You had to get a prescription from a doctor. And that was a huge bar to public health access. So at that point, the state had to act and amend its pharmacy practice rules to permit access at pharmacies without a prescription. There was a blanket prescription provided to pharmacies to distribute these important public health vaccines. In addition, there were state requirements for insurance coverage because a lot of times insurance companies will determine which vaccines will be covered based upon recommendations of committees like this. So what seems like just an advisory committee, they don't make policy directly a lot of times, has had a huge impact on operations for public health. There are additional changes on the horizon as well. The MAHA Commission report that was introduced earlier this year has a lot of information or a lot of policies that it has begun to take steps to address. One is with regard to childhood vaccines. There have already been changes made to the childhood vaccine schedule, particularly with the MMR. And there was debate about the recommendation for hepatitis B vaccination that will be picked up again next month. All of these decisions, again, have an impact on what is covered by insurers as well as Medicare and Medicaid. So it will have long-term impact on our ability to access these public health tools. In addition, things that are on the MAHA Commission agenda are things like psychiatric medications. There's a real blind spot that has been a concern, particularly for the medical providers in the psychiatric space. There's a misunderstanding, or appears to be a misunderstanding about the use of psychiatric medications. There's been a push in the MAHA community to get away from the use of psychiatric medications, particularly in young people, without really looking at alternatives and not considering the impact on the patients if they're not able to access these medications that their doctors have said that they need. There has also been an effort in Congress to act on some of these limitations on liability shelters for manufacturers of products like vaccines. There's a certain segment of Congress that is not a fan of the liability shields that were part of the PrEP Act during COVID. And they have introduced twice now the Liable Act in Congress, which is intended to roll back the PrEP Act protections and restore manufacturer liability for COVID vaccine injuries. This would be a retroactive application of manufacturer liability, which could drastically reshape the insurance underwriting and risk management practices surrounding these products. It is very unlikely that this act will actually pass. It is most likely going to die in committee again, but it's always possible that it could be reintroduced at another time. Then another vaccine matter that has been a particular cause of concern for Secretary Kennedy is the Gardasil vaccine. And his appointment as Secretary of Health and Human Services has brought some renewed scrutiny to the HPV vaccine that adds to this climate of legal uncertainty. The manufacturers of Gardasil recently had a big win in court. The challenge to the safety and effectiveness failed, but it is likely they will appeal and continue to try to move this forward. Again, we talked with regard to the advisory committee at CDC about the new members having a degree of, or they did not have as much vetting as previous members of the committee, and that there are concerns about financial conflicts of interest. We know that Secretary Kennedy does have a conflict of interest. He is part of the Gardasil litigation funding and stands to gain if this litigation does move forward and is successful. With that, I will turn it back to you, Zuhal.
Thank you, Kate. So, next, I'll be talking about a story that's been one of the biggest regulatory reversals of the year, and that is the FDA's vacated rule on lab developed tests or LDTs. So, if you were here last year, you'll remember that we talked about how FDA was finally moving forward with a long anticipated plan to bring LDTs under its medical device authority. That's been debated for well over a decade. But as of this year, that rule has officially been struck down and completely vacated, and we've returned to the pre rule status quo. So let's unpack how we got here and why this matters. On May 6, 2024, the FDA issued a final rule that essentially amended the definition of an in vitro diagnostic device, or an IVD, to explicitly include cases where the manufacturer is a laboratory. Now that sounds like a very small tweak, but it was a major shift. For decades, FDA has exercised what it called enforcement discretion over most lab developed tests. That meant the agency technically had authority but chose not to enforce device regulations against labs, leaving oversight largely to CMS under the CLIA program. The 2024 rule was meant to change that by phasing out this discretion over several years, requiring labs to register their tests, report adverse events, comply with quality system regulations, and for higher risk tests, submit pre market review just like any other medical device manufacturer. For laboratories, hospitals, and biotech partners, that would have been a huge operational lift. So that means new compliance costs, longer time to market, and likely higher insurance and legal exposure. But the FDA's argument was that modern LDTs are no longer simple in house tests. They often use complex instrumentation, software, and are marketed nationwide. So, in FDA's view, they should be regulated like commercial devices. Then came the legal challenge. A coalition led by the American Clinical Laboratory Association sued the FDA, arguing that the agency had exceeded its statutory authority. And in March 2025, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas agreed and vacated the rule in full. The court's reasoning was very straightforward. Under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a device is defined as a tangible article, something you can hold in your hand. LDTs, by contrast, are professional services performed within a laboratory. They may use instruments and reagents, but the service itself, which is the analysis and interpretation, isn't a device. The court also pointed out that Congress has already created a separate regulatory framework for labs through CLIA, and the FDA's attempt to regulate laboratory services as devices effectively duplicated and conflicted with that regime. Following that decision, FDA did not appeal within the 60-day window, and by September 2025, the agency formally rescinded the rule, restoring the regulatory text to what it was before the 2024 final rule. So, at least for now, the longstanding policy of CLIA oversight and FDA enforcement discretion has been restored. So, what does this all mean for those of us who are advising or insuring companies in this space? Now, for diagnostic laboratories, this is obviously a relief. The immediate threat of FDA device regulation is off the table. You remain primarily under CLIA oversight. But this isn't a time to relax entirely. The court decision hinged on statutory interpretation, not on the science or the safety of those tests. That means the FDA or even Congress could still revisit LDT oversight through new legislation or narrower rulemaking. Now, for biotech and pharma partners that rely heavily on LDTs, especially for companion diagnostic or biomarker testing, this decision reintroduces some uncertainty. Right now, your LDT partners aren't subject to FDA pre-market review, but that could change again. So it's worth reviewing contracts to ensure you have change in law clauses, audit rights, and a plan if regulatory oversight should shift mid-project. How about for legal, risk, and insurance professionals? So this is a great case study in how agency authority is being re-examined. The court's reasoning reflects the broader trend after recent Supreme Court decisions, limiting agency deference and demanding clear congressional authorization. So, from a risk management standpoint, that means regulatory assumptions are now more fluid than ever. You can't just look at a proposed rule and assume that it's going to stand unchallenged. So, even though we're back under CLIA for now, it's advisable for companies to keep their compliance playbooks flexible, their contracts adaptable, and their communications very clear because diagnostic regulation remains definitely one of the most dynamic and legally contested frontiers in healthcare. So, definitely one to keep an eye on. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Kate.
So our next topic is tariffs and supply chain localization. In 2025, the US trade policy underwent a massive shift with the implementation of tariffs on pharmaceutical and medical device products. These types of products used to be largely exempt from tariffs, and now they're subject to rates that range from 10% on general imports to 25% on finished drugs and devices, and up to 145% on Chinese-made APIs. This is intended to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers and to incentivize companies to come back to domestic manufacturing. But in the meantime, there has been major impact on the industry. So first of all, there have been tremendous cost pressures. Because the tariffs have driven up the input costs for both drugs and devices, there have been a number of price hikes as well as product shortages. A number of drugs are already priced 3 to 4 times higher in the US than they are abroad, and this could get even worse in the coming months as we see still these very high tariffs on imported raw materials. There's also an issue with regard to supply chains. If manufacturers are faced with this level of tariff, then they may not be able to use the same supply chain that they always have. It may cause them to shake up where they're sourcing all of their materials. There is a rationale to this that the government is looking to incentivize that domestic production, but that takes time, and reshoring can be really complex, particularly because of the complexity of the products as well as what it takes to begin operations in this space. So there are going to be supply chain bottlenecks. Companies are going to be forced to have to rebuild a domestic supply chain. Right now, over 80% of the top generic drugs use APIs that are sourced abroad. And 72% of FDA-approved API facilities are located outside of the United States. If your active drug ingredient isn't made here, then you are going to be hit with that tariff. If you can source it in the United States, there may be additional challenges for you. A lot of times companies will contract with a particular supplier to be maybe the exclusive purchaser of a given API. This inhibits the ability to approach additional suppliers or for other manufacturers to approach the same supplier and attempt to purchase the material from them. There's also, this could be a major cost driver that is particularly difficult for generic drugs. Generic drugs operate on very thin margins, and if they're forced to pay an additional 20 to 100% or more, then they may be vulnerable and in some cases even driven from the market. It is likely that if these manufacturers are unable to keep up with the current scale of production, that there will be shortages imposed on the public eventually. There will at the very least be delays in production. And as we know, delays in production equal delayed sales. So the work that goes into creating a domestic supply chain is going to be hampered. The companies are going to need a lot of money in order to be able to build plants or expand their current production. A lot of times, manufacturers of generic drugs, if they change the supplier of their API or any of the excipients, they may have to revalidate their manufacturing procedure. It all takes time, it takes money, and in the meantime, these companies are not able to get their normal products onto the market, leading to delays for the consumer. So if we are eventually able to develop a domestic manufacturing supply chain, this could be a valuable resource for manufacturers of finished goods in the United States. But if it works, it will be a long-term solution. In the short term, these companies are going to be pinched either by being forced to pay the cost of the tariffs, or through being driven from the market due to these costs, or having supply delays. There's also a question of staffing. Can the US labor market compete with the competitor markets? If the cost of labor outside of the United States is so much lower than it is domestically, this is what drove companies overseas years ago. If eventually these tariffs are removed, if there is a change in administration or just a change in policy, the incentive to continue operating in the United States sort of goes away. And the cost there may not be that equalizer of cost between labor and domestic labor and tariffs. So what this means right now is that there is a lot of volatility for manufacturers in the life sciences industry. They are looking at confusion in their supply chains. They may have to renegotiate contracts, reconfigure their supplier networks, and then validate all of these new materials, which all introduces a lot of lead time, operational uncertainty, and it cuts into their profit margins and their ability to continue to invest in their company, invest in onshoring, and continue their operations. It is a challenge that will continue to face the industry in the coming year. And we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. This is a point of real uncertainty right now and instability for the industry as a whole. And on that happy note, I will turn it back to you, Zuhal.
Thank you, Kate. All right, so back in February 2024, the FDA published its Medical Devices Quality System Regulation Amendments Final Rule, and basically it officially amended 21 CFR Part 820, the longstanding Quality System Regulation, or QSR, to rename and reshape it into QMSR, effective February 2nd, 2026. So basically, the QMSR incorporates by reference the international standard ISO 13485-2016, the internationally recognized standard for medical device quality management systems. But it also continues to apply to finished medical device manufacturers under FDA regulation, while aligning the US requirements with a more global consensus. And the effective date of it is February 2nd, 2026, which means that while you must still comply with the old QSR right now, you should be transitioning your quality system so that when that date arrives, your documentation, processes, suppliers, and inspection readiness map onto the QMSR expectations. So from a compliance and legal risk perspective, the changes under QMSR matter for several critical reasons. Number one is harmonization with ISO 13485. Now, for firms selling devices globally, this is a big deal. The shift means that US systems are being aligned with global practices, simplifying convergence and reducing duplication of effort. Number two, expanded inspection scope. So, under the new rule, records that historically had certain protections or were less likely to be reviewed, for example, internal audit reports, supplier audit reports, management review documentation, may now be subjected to FDA inspection. The pre-QSR exemptions are being removed. Next, supplier controls, risk-based approaches, and documentation expectations. The QMSR carries more emphasis on the risk-based nature of quality systems, external document control, traceability, and alignment of processes with defined objectives, which is more in line with ISO language and practices. And fourth, and very importantly, there's an inspection methodology shift. The FDA has announced that the current quality system inspection technique will be withdrawn, and a new inspection or compliance program will take effect alongside QMSR. So firms should anticipate that FDA's inspection style will change. Now, for lawyers, risk professionals, and insurers, these changes increase the stakes of quality system oversight. If you're auditing a device manufacturer, underwriting device liability, or advising on global compliance, you need to ask, is this company ready for QMSR? How will they show objective evidence of compliance? And what happens to supplier contracts, design records, complaints, and CAPA logs? So, what can we expect to see? Now, as the deadline approaches, we might see increased enforcement activity or warning letter citations around quality system gaps tied to supplier controls, internal audits, management reviews, particularly for companies that are slow to transition. You may expect regulators globally aligning even further. So firms already certified to ISO 13485 may benefit from this, but they shouldn't assume full compliance automatically covers all US specific QMSR elements because there are a lot of them. Next, contractual, legal, and insurance frameworks are expectedly going to evolve. So what you can potentially expect is perhaps more focus on quality system readiness, documentation audits, regulatory change risk clauses, and supplier governance tied to QMSR. So how can you prepare for these changes? There's a variety of things you can do. You might want to start with conducting a gap assessment. So map your QSR system to ISO 13485 and the QMSR clauses. You'll definitely need to update SOPs and your quality manual with new terminology, new definitions. It'll be important to strengthen supplier quality agreements and audit rights. You're going to want to train teams on updated record keeping and inspection protocols. You can expect definitely expanded FDA access to internal and supplier audit records. So you're going to want to watch for things like increased enforcement as FDA tests out its new inspection model. And for legal and contractual readiness, I already said this, but you'll want to add change in law clauses and quality system representation. So this will all be incredibly important in preparing for these changes. And with that, I will hand it back over to Heather.
Yes, I see that you covered all the questions that came in from the registration. So we can just go ahead and wrap it up right at basically at the hour mark. So thank you, Kate and Zuhal, for summarizing the 2025 hot topics into 1 hour. It's a hard task, but you have accomplished it year over year. If you want to stay on top of the latest industry topics in 2026, subscribe to our newsletter on medmarc.com, which will provide you with future webinar invitations and blog posts on current life sciences industry topics. Let's see what 2026 has in store for us.